Constructive Thinking is a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Stephen Hamilton, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs for Ontario for PCAC. Today we will be talking with Sam Duncan, Vice President, Ontario for Wellington Advocacy, on the Ontario 2026 budget, a plan to protect Ontario, what it means for the construction industry, PCA members, and our advocacy work. This program was taped on April 1st, 2026. I hope you enjoy.
Sam Duncan, welcome back to Constructive Thinking. You're one of our repeat podcast guests, and it's always great to have you on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be joining you today.
Today, we're going to be talking about the 2026 Ontario budget, which was tabled last week. This is a big spending budget called A Plan to Protect Ontario. $238.4 billion in total spending, a deficit of $13.8 billion. Net debt as a percentage of GDP is going up 37.7%, and they're forecasting 1% GDP this year. And this is all within the backdrop of geopolitical uncertainty, very high oil prices, a trade instability with the United States. Maybe walk us through, from a big picture standpoint, what is the government trying to achieve with this budget, both as a political document and a communications document? Did they achieve that, and what are the key themes that they're trying to present?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Look, I think the first way to look at any budget document is, as you say, it's a political document. This is a document that gets put together primarily by the Premier's office and the Ministry of Finance as a setting of the priorities of the government. The numbers are what they are, and they are developed by the Ministry of Finance with some. As someone who's worked on this, there's always a little bit of tweaking you can do on the numbers depending upon how much you weigh one variable versus the other. And so this should be looked at as a very political document. And what does that say? I think what this says for the Ford government is they are perfectly comfortable to have a higher spending kind of government than we've traditionally seen from Conservatives. There is not a strong desire within the electorate for a balanced budget. There's not pressure to their right saying you need to reduce expenditures, you need to limit the size and growth of government. There's actually pressure where there is pressure. It's on the left saying you need to spend more and do more. You know, Minister Bethlen-Falvey, I think, is doing his best as a fiscal conservative to ensure that the government has reins in their spending as best they can. But I don't think you can call this a lowest spending kind of government. The Premier's been very committal on there being no cuts to public services, and as a result, you know, with inflation and other pressures, spending kind of can only go up. I would say they've got a theme in their budgets when you look at the numbers is to kind of under-promise and over-deliver on the actuals kind of each year, while at the same time pushing out the balance state further and further and trying to show kind of meaningful progress each year on the deficit, but not actually having a balance. I think that's probably going to continue. There's no real political pressure for the government to rein in spending, especially in the times of uncertainty, right? You've got threats from the Americans on the tariff side. You've got, you know, the Iran war that is making, you know, a pretty volatile outlook. I did note just very quickly the price of oil that they have put into their budget is massively outdated already. I think they added about a $70 barrel of oil, and that will have material impact on their numbers. Sorry, it's about $60 US was the number, and that'll, I think, have obviously some pressures to their numbers and to the budget.
I guess from their standpoint, one of the arguments that can be made, because this seems like a very steady as you go budget, not a lot of changes to expenditures year over year. And perhaps an argument can be made that you don't want to overreact to geopolitical changes. You don't want to overreact to things. So maybe a large pivot might seem to make sense for some people at this time. There's you know, you don't want an overcorrection either. One thing that kind of stuck out to me in the budget was even with the trade instability with the US, which is very well documented, there was only a 1% decline in exports from Ontario last year. So really hasn't had the GDP impact that perhaps some people were suggesting over the past 12 months. That stood out to me in the budget. Another thing that stood out to me is while the narratives have kind of changed a bit, the spending on infrastructure still is significant. There is $210 billion capital plan over 10 years, $37 billion in planned capital spending for this year alone, record amounts in public transit, health infrastructure, highways, of course. So that seems to be one of the big, if the Premier has a focus, it's and an ambition, it's about building Ontario. You see the commercials all the time on TV promoting this, so people are aware of what they're spending. Maybe talk a bit, do you think that's where they want people to focus on some of on that type of expenditure?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think how they view expenditures broadly is they want to ensure that there's no cuts to social services, education, kind of transfers to people to ensure that the opposition can't come after them for cutting. And so they're kind of playing those areas to a draw to say, like, look, we're not going to cut back, but we're not going to make massive new investments in these areas because we just don't have the fiscal capacity to do so. Where they are very ambitious is on, as you say, a capital plan. This government has from day one been committed to building infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, transit, hospitals, and that's a huge priority of the Premier, a huge priority of the government. And, I think you've seen a lot of political success out of that. I think good economic success out of that. And they're really going to double down and have been doubling down on major kind of infrastructure projects. And it's an area where when I think we look back at the Ford government, however many years after, the big legacy will be the massive infrastructure investments that the Premier has made in this province.
So this is the second budget since the last election. It's been barely a year since they were reelected to another very strong majority government. If you're going to make big changes to the budget, you would think you would do it now, outside of an election in another 2+ years. They don't seem to be doing that. The Liberal Party is still with an interim leader. They haven't really started the leadership race, but they're going to have a new leader this year. From the opposition standpoint, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot to poke on this budget. Obviously, that's intentional for the government. But how should the official opposition be reacting to the Ford style of governing? It doesn't seem like they're giving them a lot of major things to be too upset about.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. Ford has done a masterful political job at kind of neutralizing his critics on the center left, and while not being exposed to any kind of real pressure or criticism from a more kind of conservative bent that might be wanting massive reductions in government spending or privatization of services or massively lower income tax and other taxes. And as a result, when the opposition's really failed to deliver a narrative that kind of has resonated with people to criticize what the government's doing, because in a lot of ways, he's carrying on kind of a status quo of government services, and that is hard for an opposition to critique something that doesn't change. And I think the Premier has a really good feel for what Ontarians want. His political style is definitely, with all the people he talks to, he brags about how many calls he has with citizens and text messages. That's real, right? And he's got a massive feedback of real people that aren't in the kind of political bubble world. And he does a great job of reflecting back politically what those people want. And what those people want is they don't want to see massive reductions in government spending, and they want to see investments in new areas. I think where the rubber hits the road is, at some point, tough decisions kind of need to be made for the government. I mentioned based as flight reduction in exports to the United States. I think that's primarily because most goods are still covered by CUSMA or USMCA exemptions, with the exception of steel and autos that have been kind of targeted. And so I think the real risk here is, say, the federal government is unsuccessful in negotiating a comprehensive new trade deal with the United States and Mexico, and we lose that ad access, which we have not actually lost yet, to the United States for most of our goods. Like what happens to Ontario, and what happens to the numbers in the budget, and that could force some really, really difficult choices. And I think you saw in this budget a reflection of that being a risk. The projections they use for GDP and employment growth are pretty conservative. They're pretty low, I think, with what other kind of folks anticipate. And they've, like always, they always have a little bit of a contingency fund left over. So I think they understand that risk. I would say it would be nice to have a little bit more of a buffer. Like, the reason you balance your budget or you get kind of spending under control is for times when like major risks occur, and they have less flexibility should the worst case scenario happen fiscally because of the kind of the political choices that they've made, which I can't fault them with the success of them. They've been very, very successful. But I think the caution is, does the rubber hit the road in the next year or two? And what does the government do if it faces some very, very difficult choices?
So only a couple of days after the budget, the provincial government and the federal government made a significant announcement on housing. Now, a few years ago, during the height of housing demand, where, let's say in 2022, when you saw record numbers of immigration, you saw kind of the fear of missing out mentality amongst home buyers, record housing prices really off the charts. The government made at that point a very ambitious commitment to build 1.5 million new homes over, I think, 7 years. Now, that clearly won't be met, and the opposition's making quite a bit of noise about that. The announcement a couple days ago was around, number one, the HST rebate, which will be a full rebate up to $1 million for a new house, and now a rebate system or cutting of the development charges up to, I think, 40 or 50% for new homes. Clearly, that seems to be a priority. That sector of construction has seen a bust that is really unprecedented in modern times. The new housing industry never saw a correction like they did in the United States in 2007, 2008. And so they do seem to be putting a lot of resources into the new housing sector. Maybe speak a little bit about those initiatives and those investments. They probably won't hit the $1.5 million target. But again, in housing supply, a lot of it's due to immigration, which the federal government has cut back somewhat substantially over the past couple of years. And just a natural, I don't think Canada's as seen as the destination it once was for immigrants because of housing in particular, but a whole bunch of other factors. Maybe speak a little bit about the emphasis this government has on new housing that they've interestingly put out a couple days after the budget.
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, housing remains like a very critical priority for the premier, for the government. Where they did spend new money, very clearly on housing. First in the budget with the reduction of HST on new home purchases, which makes a ton of sense. I think that is a great policy to help ease affordability where taxes are a burden, and to be limited to homes under $1 million. It really does target kind of, weird to say now, like middle class folks. It's insane that when we talk about the housing that things under $1 million now apply there, but it'll help in parts of the province too, outside of Toronto, right? I think I'm based in Toronto. I'm guilty of this sometimes myself. Everyone kind of thinks Toronto is the province, but it isn't, right? And so where this policy will really help is in smaller communities, smaller towns, smaller areas where home prices aren't as dramatic as they are in Toronto and in the greater GTA. And so this will have some help for folks in that area. I think, a theme that I've seen with this government is specifically when it relates to the federal government's role and the development charge change as an example is there's a real hesitancy from the provincial government and from the federal government to make, significant changes on the taxation side, notwithstanding the HST one, which is temporary and for a few years. They're more inclined to spend borrowed money to try to reduce the cost of housing. So look, the province and the feds do not have the billions of dollars that they committed to in this announcement. They're going to have to borrow that money. And so they're borrowing that money to spend to reduce, as opposed to making kind of structural changes to things like land transfer taxes. Like, I think if you wanted to look at ways to really reduce some of the costs that would be broadly across the system is take a very regressive land transfer tax at the provincial level kind of out of the equation. I think that could have a very significant impact. Whereas, taking borrowed money to get 3 levels of government involved in some form of rebate, I think is going to be a big challenge. I think the operationalization of this will be a big challenge. Having worked in government, one government bureaucracy is difficult enough to manage, let alone a municipal government bureaucracy, a federal government bureaucracy, and a provincial government bureaucracy, and the cost to administer that will be great. Whereas if there could be more broad-based measures at the taxation level that reduces revenue, I think could be easier to administer, have greater impacts. However, governments are addicted to revenue, right? And as they keep spending, they don't want to give up revenue. So I'm cautious about the DC plan. I want to kind of wait and see how it works out. We've seen the market already start to adjust back on the pricing side as prices are starting to kind of soften as immigration kind of recedes. However, there's still that political desire from politicians to not see home prices really reduce, right? Existing home prices reduce, because those are voters. None of us want to see our home values go down because we view them as assets or investments. That said, they're quite high, and they probably do need to come down a bit. And as more supply, kind of comes on, that should have that impact. And so I think there's always this devil and angel on the shoulder of politicians when they think about housing, which is they want to make it more affordable, but they actually don't want to reduce kind of existing home values for voters because they don't want to face a backlash. And so, I think it's a difficult policy space to be in, and one that the government, I think, to its credit, has really tried to be activist and engaging in. I think the HST reduction is a great policy. We're really excited for that. I'm kind of want to see how the DC policy plays out. I'm a little more skeptical that that'll have the impact that the government's looking for.
And I think what's challenging too is when you do these temporary taxation reliefs, it's always hard to put it back on. There's going to be then you're all of a sudden you're increasing DCs 40 or 50% when the program ends. So that will be a challenge going down the road when these initiatives come to their conclusion.
Stephen, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. There really isn't.
Another thing that stood out to me in the budget was the Protect Ontario Account Investment Fund. This is a new $4 billion fund, which will identify and execute on a pipeline of investment opportunities to advance Ontario's long-term economic and strategic priorities. Very open-ended language in this fund. This comes after last year's budget, which established something called the Building Ontario Fund, which kind of operates like the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I know there's some differences. It would probably disagree both at the Canada Infrastructure Bank and Build Ontario Fund, but generally speaking, that was a capital investment account to spend on building. It's interesting that they're using these investment vehicles with the purpose of trying to attract private sector investment in different areas. I'm curious about this approach because after the Building Ontario Fund was launched, we haven't heard too much about it. Now we have a new fund, a $4 billion fund with a much more ambiguous mandate. Maybe talk about the government's approach here. Obviously, I understand that the intent is to try to get as much private sector investment as possible. But it is interesting the significant amounts of funding they're putting into these initiatives with kind of unclear objectives.
I noticed this as well, Stephen. First, the Protect Ontario Account Investment Fund. Could they have come up with a more bureaucratic and obtuse name? Anyway, that's just a pet peeve of mine. I don't understand how anyone will understand what that is when hearing about it. It sounds very kind of Orwellian. But look, I think it's a very interesting idea. Like it's a kind of another form of industrial policy. This government's been very keen on having the public sector involved in the economy at an investment level. You've seen it with the battery plants investments, the Building Ontario Fund, the Invest Ontario Fund, and now this new Protect Ontario Account Investment Fund. I'm gonna have to remember that. But I think one of the most interesting things about it is it's clearly an attempt to try to diversify, Ontario's economy. There's a recognition inherent in that they feel like there's a threat to kind of the existing core of Ontario's economic base being manufacturing. That might not be coming back with the American tariffs and threats and the Chinese advancements in advanced manufacturing themselves. And so it's a recognition that there needs to be new areas of growth. And so they kind of, I think, acknowledge that and acknowledge that probably there's some diversification away from the US market that can play a role there. Obviously, the details are very light, but from my read, it feels like, Ontario's trying to kind of play the role of like high net worth investor in the investment space. So like a limited partner is the language that they use, which is a traditional language for, basically rich people who give their money to someone else to invest on their behalf in new businesses and, either in the private equity or hedge fund or venture capital space. And so they're very much taking a look at how the private sector makes investment decisions and trying to kind of put public money on the table that could crowd in kind of private capital. They mentioned, Canadian pension funds as being a prime example. I think the question is, what are they going to be investing in? I think Canada does not have a capital problem when it comes to investing into businesses. We've got a business formation problem and we've got a competitiveness problem. It's great to have the capital to deploy, but we need entrepreneurs to have ideas and to want to start businesses and to grow. And there's a lot of barriers, I think, at the structural level that is challenging folks here in Ontario to take risks and start new businesses and grow. And I think there might be some other areas they could look at a little bit closer to the individual level that can spur economic growth and development. But look, I think this is a unique idea. I'd love to learn a little bit more about it. I think it has some risks of working out, but at the same time, it actually could work out very, very successful if they find the right private sector manager of the portfolio, and that there's a ton of private sector capital that does come in, and the province can be spurring that. So I give them a bit of credit. I think this is a unique idea. I'd like to see some more details, but it would also benefit, I think, from an approach that recognizes there's some other kind of structural barriers to business formation in the province here that could also be addressed alongside this.
As a construction association, PCA doesn't really have a strong opinion about these investment vehicles. The only basic concern we have is if you're attracting certain pension fund investment into, let's say, new capital, is that public funds, if they're being paired with private sector pension funds, that the construction work should be procured competitively. It would be natural for certain pension funds that are affiliated with different unions to want to see that the labor that goes into those projects only coming from certain unions. That would be a natural tendency I would think that they'd be pushing towards. So it's something as an association we're going to be watching. We've met with the Building Ontario Fund folks. They're aware with our concerns, and certainly that's not the intent of their mandate. They want to see things built in a competitive fashion. They want to see new investment. But that's something we're going to be watching for. I'm curious, the final question for you is around competition. Obviously a theme near and dear to PCA. Where does competition fit into this? Last year, we saw the budget really focusing on energy procurement. And since then, we've seen ISO, the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, take a much more active role in procurement. That, on the face of it, is a positive thing because they're more concerned with a competitive procurement process compared to just sole sourcing it to OPG or Hydro One. And so where our members cannot work. So maybe close on what the government views or how the government is emphasizing, or if they're emphasizing competition within this productivity. And I guess there are some glimmers of hope within the energy sector over the next little while with the investments being made there and ISO taking a more prominent role in procurement. But how does the PCA narrative around competition and how does that fit into this budget document and the next year going forward?
So I would say when it comes to the Ford government, they don't have necessarily a guiding kind of overall framework that they use to make decisions on that is consistent across industries or sectors. They're very good at kind of isolating decisions and looking at them individually and not being worried if that decision might seem counterintuitive to another decision if they view it as what's best. So that's a long way of saying that I think the issue of competition depends upon the sector that you're talking to and who is making the decision. So I agree. There is a lot of opportunity in the energy space. That is an area where costs are rapidly increasing, both in like the build out, but also at the kind of individual level in terms of energy costs to consumers and businesses. And obviously the build out with public dollars, ratepayers at the end of the day are ultimately paying for that. And so there is a ton of, I think, important work that can be done there to make the case for why competition in this space will help reduce costs. That will ultimately help reduce costs for consumers and businesses, but also on the construction side. And that's an area where it is encouraging to see kind of a more arm's length decision making body. It takes the politics out of it, frankly, which I think is helpful. But that said, so I think that's where there's some opportunities, some success. I think broadly in other areas, though, I think there's cause for kind of caution on how ambitious the government wants to be on competition. Like their narrative is protecting Ontario. That is inherently a protectionist message, right? And there is a desire amongst Ontarians because they keep, they elected this government under that banner to be worried and be risk averse right now with what's going on in the world. And so there is a little bit of like a bunker down and kind of risk averse mentality. And kind of opening up competition does add some risk. It adds up some unknowns into things from the government. You might have new players that are getting new contracts in other spaces that previously had not operated with the government. And so I think there is some caution on some of the other areas that the PCA has been working on outside of energy, that more movement towards more competition. It will be a bit of a challenge in this kind of political environment where this Protect Ontario protectionist kind of sentiment is there. That said, thankfully they are spending so much money in capital that I think there's a lot of opportunities just broadly, but for actual policy change outside of kind of these areas, I think it'll be hard. It'll be hard to get them to start thinking about this just from where the political narrative is and where it appears people are. And so if we want to change that, I think it's kind of getting Ontarians on side a little bit to seeing why this is a good thing and why competition isn't risky, and competition, it can be consistent with this kind of Protect Ontario narrative. But right now, I do see a little bit of a a challenge in that regard.
It's interesting. If you look at the government's mission statement in the budget, we'll just conclude on this point. The government's mission statement is to build the most competitive, resilient, and self-reliant economy in the G7. That statement comes directly from the budget document. Obviously, highly ambitious language there. So you're right. There's obviously a natural tension between the budget protecting Ontario and building the most competitive, resilient, and self-reliant economy in the G7, perhaps. Sam, I'll end it there. Is there any final comments or messages you want that we may have missed?
No, look, I think just to conclude, I think the Premier and the government achieved what they were looking to achieve with this document, with this budget. They weren't looking to make a ton of fanfare. They were looking to avoid criticism, to present something that the markets would receive well, which they have. Show that there's no cuts, and show that the Premier is kind of focused on protecting Ontario and the things that he'd like to achieve. These budgets in the past had been kind of bigger endeavors. The Ford government has really tried to steady as she goes, play down the ambition of our expectations of these documents to, and I think that's been to great political effect. And certainly they're very happy with how this has rolled out, the coverage they've received, and now we're already kind of moving on to the next thing, and I think they're very happy with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us again, Sam. Always great to have you on, and we'll talk soon.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.